against women. So some harmful practices might be things like child brides, which still happen in some parts of the world. I'm actually looking at a particular case between West and Central Africa, where young women at the age of 5 or 6 are sold off to older men, and they are forced to marry these men when they get older. So such practices need to be eliminated. Recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work. We know that so often women do most of the care work, most of the domestic work. This is not properly valued. They are not properly compensated for this work. How often do we hear derogatory phrases such as "she's just a housewife," right? Growing up in a family of 10, I have 10 siblings. I know that my mom worked really full time, right, taking care of us, and the role she played was very much indispensable, right? Even though my dad left the house to go to the office and work, but my mom's work at home made it possible for his own work and also for our own growth. So that kind of work needs to be recognized and valued. Equal opportunities and participation for women in leadership positions, universal access to sexual and reproductive health, give women equal rights and equal rights to economic resources, using technology to promote the empowerment of women, and finally adopt and strengthen policies and legislation on gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, right? So our goal is to think of how we can achieve these targets using cultural heritage, both as a driver and also as an enabler. And the question will be, how do we do this within the context of the metropolis, right? And here I want to invite us to think of the metropolis not simply as the urban centers, right, with millions of people, like Lagos in Nigeria, or Delhi, or Calcutta, right? So we always have to think of the metropolis as also connected with what we might call, we might term as the rural, right? What we might describe as the rural. These two are not separated from each other. So the metropolis is not this island that is self-sufficient, right? The metropolis needs the rural area, so they both feed into each other. So when we think of the metropolis, we should also think of the rural areas that feed into the metropolis. I'll give you an example, right? So in Nigeria, I'm from a rural area in the southern part of Nigeria. We don't have any major metropolis, around us. Yet there are strong ties and connections between these rural areas and the metropolis. Every day we see vehicles move a lot of food from the rural areas to feed the people in the metropolis. And as the holiday season is coming, right, we're going to see a lot of people emptying out of the metropolis and coming back to the rural areas. And apart from during these seasons, we also see capital inflows, right? Capital inflows from the metropolis or the urban areas coming into the rural areas. So we need to always think of these as being very much interconnected. When we speak of the metropolis, when we speak of heritage, we should think of the urban areas with millions of people being very much connected to the rural the rural areas as well. We see there's so much of movement between the rural areas to the urban areas, and this is a phenomenon across globally. Though there are conversations now on impact of COVID-19, and a lot of people moving back into the rural areas, right? So with some companies or organizations allowing remote work, right? So people moving from the urban areas back into the rural areas. But this is not the case across the world, right? So we might see this mostly in the global north, where there is well-developed infrastructure in the rural areas. But if you go to other parts of the global south, it becomes very difficult to do this, again, because of the lack of infrastructure, such as high-speed internet connections in these rural areas. So, and given that in some of these rural areas, there aren't many job opportunities, right, in the sector or in what we might consider the modern industrial sector, it is very difficult for people to move into these places to try to work remotely. However, within these rural settings, right, there is a lot that these have to offer to us in terms of cultural heritage. I'll give you an example. I just mentioned that I grew up in a very rural area. My grandmother was a herbal medicine practitioner, right? And most of our specialty was on treating women who have fertility issues. A lot of the clients that came to her to the rural areas, they actually came from the urban areas, right? So these were people that had experimented with modern forms of medicine, and it didn't really work for them, right? So they came to the rural area, where my grandmother would treat them primarily using herbs. And I'm so privileged that I was part of this process, because I was one of those young boys that my grandmother would send to the forest to harvest the different kinds of herbs that she used in treating these people. But within that rural setting, she was able to develop herself, right, economically. She was able to pass on a lot of knowledge, right, that had been given to her, to pass that knowledge on to the next generation. And because of the role she played within this community as a healer that people came to, she was respected, right? No one would have seen her or would think that she is subordinate, or would think of her as being unequal, right? Even though this is a patriarchal society. But because she was able to practice what was considered a very important practice within the community, bringing healing to so many other people, right? She was able to have that respect within the community, and she had that respect because her work, her heritage was very much of value. Again, I'm making this point again to emphasize that we can't make these strong distinctions, right, between the rural and the urban, right? Because the two feed each other. The two nourish each other. And even today, the growing phenomenon is that of the megalopolis, right? So we are seeing a lot of these urban or metropolis, the networks expanding rapidly, that they are moving beyond just one city. You know, like in the US here, I'm in New York. We speak of the northeast corridor, which goes all the way from Massachusetts through New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, right? So all of these are connected together into this megalopolis, and sometimes these even transcend international boundaries, right? So you might think of the Abidjan, Accra, Lagos megalopolis that is rapidly growing. So we need to think of these as one. And when we think of cultural heritage, we need to consider both the urban, and we also need to consider the rural, right? So we have to connect the rural with the urban to create this metropolis, right? So the cultures of the rural can be preserved, and these cultures can also, or this heritage that we see and is very much preserved within the rural, will help to nourish and also feed the urban areas, right? And some of those things that we can preserve within these rural systems of agriculture, right? So you think about in some of these rural areas, women have their own crops that they cultivate, and the ways in which they cultivate these crops. Or we can see this sometimes in terms of cooking or taste, right? So there are certain kinds of food, and again, with the advent of social media, again, these connections, right, where you see Instagram videos, TikTok videos, people posting their TikTok videos of the foods that they produce, and maybe somebody in an urban area might place an order for what is being produced within the rural, a certain kind of food, and is being shipped through these transportation networks between the rural and the urban. So when we think of the metropolis, right, we have to think of it as people-centered. And here I just want to make a point that women are people and young girls are people, right? So the specific needs of women and the specific needs of young girls need to be taken into consideration in metropolitan planning, and also in terms of heritage management. The women who inhabit, or the girls who inhabit even the metropolis, right, they are carrying their heritage with them, and they live their heritage each day and each moment. In fact, they are their heritage, right? And this is where, again, we need to be very careful, because sometimes when we speak of heritage, the tendency is to go to what we might call the tangible heritage, right? Or we might try to fix it on sites, right? Sites and monuments. But we see that women play a very important role as custodians and also as people who nourish the intangible heritage, and that needs to be acknowledged and promoted as well. So here again, we think of heritage not as something that is apart from them, right? But heritage as something that is very much a part of them. Again, don't forget, women are people. So if you're thinking of a people-centered metropolis, we have to very much take into consideration women and young girls. The implication for this is when we are designing or redesigning the infrastructure of the metropolis, or even of tangible heritage in terms of monuments and sites, we have to be inclusive of women and young girls. And this is very, very important. It becomes even more important because a majority of architects and urban planners, right, are men. And very often when we design or when we plan, we do not take into consideration the needs of women. Let me just give you a very simple example that most of us have seen. Let's say you were asked to design or to plan a heritage site or urban infrastructure, and you need to put in 12 restrooms. Perhaps in your mind, you said, okay, if I'm going to put in 12 restrooms, there are going to be men, there are going to be women. So maybe I'm going to share those restrooms equally, right? So I'm going to put 6 men stalls and I'm going to put 6 women stalls. Yeah, that's equality, right? 6, 6. So 6 for women, 6 for men. But the question we need to ask ourselves is this: putting 6 restrooms for men and 6 restrooms for women, does this really respond to the needs of women? Let's say if a woman was doing the planning and was designing, will she put 6 restrooms for men and 6 restrooms for women? Probably not, right? If I am thinking of a gendered inclusive approach, it's not to share them equally between the men and the women, is to think of the needs of men and to think of the needs of the women. So I leave it to you to answer how many restrooms you are going to put for the men and how many restrooms you are going to put for the women. But we do know that very often at places like airports or in cultural heritage sites or train stations, places that attract a big population of people, often you see very long lines, right, in female restrooms, and it's not the case in men's restrooms. And I've actually done an experiment where I have asked, asked somebody to help me count the stalls in the women bathrooms and also counted those in the men bathroom to determine why there are longer lines in women bathrooms and shorter lines in men bathrooms. The needs of men are going to be different from the needs of the women, right? And so our infrastructure in the metropolis should reflect the diversity of these needs. Another thing I alluded to earlier in this presentation, and I want to come back to, is the question of valuing, or the issue of valuing heritage, right? Gender is very much a part of how we value heritage and also how we transmit it. Gender is a factor in how we protect or conserve heritage. Gender is a factor in how we manage heritage. These are all very important and things that we need to keep in mind when, most especially, we are talking about gender inclusivity, right? We need to keep these. We need to keep these in mind, so that in heritage management and planning, very often this reflects the society that we live in, and we know that primarily the society is very patriarchal, or is dominated by patriarchal norms. So I know there's an exercise, as a professor, that I also do an equation myself, and I look at syllabi, right? Running a center for gender studies, gender and intercultural studies. It's important to see how these are reflected in what people teach, or how people teach, right? So when you take a standard syllabi and you look at it, right, you say, oh, how many assigned readings have women or minority groups as authors? When I've had this conversation with some faculty members, again, in a white dominated area, right, in white spaces, this is something that they don't even think about, right? So sometimes they don't even think about this, right? They're just picking readings for the syllabi. We see the same even in terms of planning and heritage management, right? So when men are designing or are planning, because we are the dominant, we exercise these dominant positions within society, right? Very often we don't think, or we don't pause to bring this gendered lens, right? And we see it in how we value heritage, right? And there are very much, studies, there are very limited studies that on the role that women play within the heritage sector. But what we do know, from the limited studies, is that women dominate most of the jobs in the cultural heritage sectors, and they are also one of the primary consumers of cultural heritage. So this means that we have to be very conscious in our design and planning and management that things are gender inclusive, right? That we bring a gendered lens in how we plan, conserve, protect, manage, value, and transmit heritage. And part of what is happening here is because the heritage sector is not immune from the larger society. In fact, it is a reflection of our society, right? And our society, again, as I mentioned, is very patriarchal. So it is very easy for women to get written out of the cultural heritage and out of the history, and also their contributions neglected in the narratives or in the presentation of heritage site. So inclusive heritage in the metropolis demands that women are part of the identification processes, right? So when we are trying to identify heritage sites, when we are trying to value heritage sites, we have to have women at the table, right? Again, not tokenism where we might have one woman sit down there, and whenever she raises, she offers her own perspective and all that, and the men shut her down, right? But we need to really listen, right? We need to listen. We need to listen to them, and we need to be inclusive of their own perspective. We need to be inclusive of their own needs. It is also important that heritage that the metropolis, right, is safe for women, right? So they need to feel safe within within the metropolis. So again, when we speak of the role of cultural heritage, again, both tangible and intangible heritage as a driver and enabler of gender equality, so we need to think of how the metropolis can be safe, resilient, and sustainable, right? And so what did we do within our traditional heritage, our cultural heritage, to make sure that young women are protected, to make sure that women are protected? Because most of the urban areas are very unsafe for women, right? In terms of planning of sites, right? Do we take into consideration the form of lighting and the paths in which people have to pass through, so that women feel safe in this environment? I know in my cultural in the heritage of my people, right? Women didn't go alone to things. There were always a group of women together. That was a way in which they stayed safe. So we also need to think in terms of resilience, and this is where we see with COVID-19, for example, women were the primary caregivers during this pandemic, right? As we come through this process of recovery, right? How do we carry these women along and give them the opportunities that men deserve, the opportunities that they deserve, just as men have the opportunities, right? So they're not the ones who are constantly the givers, right? So when we need them, they just constantly give, and they just constantly give without giving them matching those with opportunities in terms of leadership, right? And then finally, again, to think about sustainable ways, right, within the metropolis. One of the big things today is recycling. And I always tell my students, I don't believe in recycling, right? I believe in reuse, because that's what my mom taught me growing up, right? So when I'm thinking of somebody who is very committed to sustainability without even knowing, having to study any of this, I think of my mother, right? Who reused everything. So if we buy, let's say, a bottle of Coke, right? So with that bottle of Coke or a bottle of water, that bottle doesn't get thrown away. It takes on a second life, and a third life, and a fourth life, right? The second life might be, it might hold water for a while in the refrigerator. After that, it might be a bottle that peanuts are put into, and sometimes those peanuts might live all the way from Nigeria and come to the US. If somebody's coming to the US, she's sending one of those bottles with peanuts from Nigeria to me. When I get that bottle, I know that, you know what? This bottle started as a bottle of water. It has transformed into a bottle of peanuts. It might transform under my care into a bottle where I'm holding oils, rather than throwing it into a recycling bin. Because within that cultural tradition, the idea was to be was not to waste anything at all, right? So even within the agricultural sector, things were constantly being reused. So when we think of sustainable habitats as well, I want to invite us, and I want to challenge us to move away from this idea of recycling. I know there's going to be some limited use of recycling in some things, but we need to move toward reuse. That should be the driving principle, right, to reuse, and women have a lot to teach us on that. Thank you very much.
Bekeh, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I think I understand when you say that you did
I
not.
can't hear you.
I'm so sorry.
I don't know if it's from my end.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So what I meant to say was that when you said you will not have a slide presentation because it's distracting, I totally get it. And because I was noting down your points, and I think, yes, because you did not have a slide presentation, it really worked out very fine for me as well. So you have made some very solid points, and I'd like to just bring out the key issues. And so first, you identified that Metropolis is not just an urban center; it's not an island. It's connected to rural areas as well, and both rural and urban feed and nourish each other. So this was amazing, and how you gave personalized example of your mother and grandmother about not recycling but reusing and giving, say, perhaps a Coke bottle first, second, third life. And I think the example you set was very, very, thought-provoking. And like first you store peanuts and then, oil, and then it goes back and forth, Nigeria and US. So the whole idea of, bring a heritage lens in planning, bring a gender lens into the planning of heritage sites, into bringing it, having an inclusive urban and regional planning. And so you have overall talked about a people-centered metropolis and people being women here, and how women are the custodians of cultural heritage. And you went on to say that women are also, this makes a lot of sense. Actually, were also the primary caregiver during the pandemic. And this is true. This is the true in the case of, I think it's a global phenomenon. Women were, in India's case as well, were the primary caregivers. And so when you say that, women play a big role as custodians of culture. So I'll give you an example in Delhi. Like during the pandemic, women are not puppeteers. The puppet shows, and we have these group of puppeteers in Delhi. So it was basically a traditional culture that the men puppeteers would be performing. But because of the pandemic, because the men had some issues and everything, so women were taught to be the puppeteers. And now we have these group of women in Delhi who are trained puppeteers and they want to perform puppeteers. So I think as far as gender equality, and so we can see beyond cultural, the men, traditional cultural custodians that were men, are also slowly, going beyond, and the women are taking over. And as far as women should be included in the identification of heritage, interpretation of heritage, its conservation, its maintenance, and finally a transmission of that heritage. So I had a question for you. Honestly, I was thinking that, okay, SDG 5 talks about gender equality, and it is focusing on women and girls. Of course, it's a very necessary. But have you thought of gender equality beyond women, like communities, LGBTQ groups, and etc., and how they can influence culture and heritage in the larger context of the metropolis?
Yes, actually, I have a few years ago with Dr. Toki Lawton Brown. We actually published an article on this in I can't remember the name of the journal right at the top of my head, and my contribution was actually on the LGBTQIA communities in America. That heritage of the LGBTQIA, and how they also contribute, and how over time we see that it's become more accepted, unlike in the past, where, let me just step back a little bit here, where we also we see a distinction between the LGBTQI communities, or people of color and minority groups, and also of white groups, right? So in terms of heritage, it was easier they were able to accept, right, the LGBTQIA heritage sites of white people, right, young white men, even before they accepted those of Black, Hispanic, Asians, and other minority groups. Yes, the conversation on gender on LGBTQIA is actually an important one as well. Yeah, in terms of.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. And I was looking at so that takes me to the other SDG. I would just want you to comment on it, the SDG 10, which actually talks about uh, inequalities.
Mhm.
It talks about diminishing of inequalities. So, do you see a relation between SDG 10 and SDG 5, and can a dialogue can happen between the two SDGs and we take it forward?
Yes, absolutely. I think what we need to think of, this is one of the things I see with the SDGs in terms of how they are labeled. But if you look at the SDGs carefully, they are all very much connected with each other, and there needs to be a dialogue between the SDGs, right? So initially, when I thought about this talk, I started seeing different forms of SDGs, as part of the original presentation. So it's important we don't think of these SDGs as isolated. We need to think of them as being very connected, and I think that's why I really like what you are doing here, looking at even SDG 11 in connection with these other SDGs. So those connections are very important, right? So we can think of inequality now, just not in terms of women. We can think of it in terms of minority groups as well. We can think of the inequalities between the north and the south, right? So there's a connection between the two. Yeah.
Okay. So we do have a question. It's from Nirmal Singh, and says that we generally see gender equality at lower and middle levels of organizations, but it is missing at top level. How can it be addressed through the SDG 5? It is there in the chat if you want to have a look at it.
Okay, let me look. Okay, that's the gender low and I think this is one of the things that society continually struggle with, not just in the heritage sector, but across society as a whole, right? Women being at a more disadvantaged position, and the situation is even worse if you are a woman of color, right? So your situation is even worse. It's going to take a very long time to address this problem, right? I don't know whether there's simply a magic bullet for solving this problem. I know in the US there have been attempts for equal, policies around equal pay and for equal work, right? Where women generally were paid 70 cents to a dollar that is made by men, right? So it is a very difficult problem to solve. Even though there have been policies trying to solve this problem, sometimes it's very, very difficult because, like, I don't know how it is in India, but in the US, for most jobs, you have to negotiate your salary. So the two of us, a man and a woman, right, go apply for the same position. When it's time to negotiate their salaries, the man might end up with a higher salary, because generally men tend to be more aggressive, right? Even in terms of these kinds of negotiations. So a way to address this and to solve this problem, I think it starts from the way we educate our young women. Perhaps educating them to be more assertive, right? Rather than educating them to be very mellow, because if they speak up, then they're being angry, pardon my word, bitch or something. We need to educate them that they have to assert themselves. They need to value themselves, and that's very, very important, right? They need to value They need to value themselves, and they should not be afraid to ask for what they deserve. And so this is going to take a lot of education, and we deal with this even within the minority groups or the Black community, for example, right? Because okay, you're afraid that if you call a higher salary, you are not going to be offered the position, or they might rescind the position. I'll speak about my own personal experience when I was getting my current job. I had to hire, when it came to salary negotiations and all of that, I had to hire a white coach to coach me, right? She kept assuring me and saying, no, Bekeh, you're an expert. Bekeh, you're a professional. They really, really want you. That's why they're giving you this offer. So you should negotiate based on that value that you are really wanted. At the same time, I talked to some of my female friends, or my African-American friends. They just took the first offer that was given to them, right? They just accepted it, right? Which means they are now starting at a lower pay, and it will take they might never be able to match up the pay of maybe a white male colleague, right? Because they started way behind. So I think the way to address this would be a lot of education of our young women. And again, education here, I don't mean certificates, because we also see that even when they get the same certificate with the men tend to get promoted higher. It can also be addressed by way of policies, right? So we know that, again, women caregivers, nourishers, right? So when there's a family member that is sick, when there's childbirth and all that, the woman takes time away from work to provide care. That care is not very much valued by society. By the time they return to work, they are now behind their colleagues, right? And so the colleagues might get promoted to management, and then they're behind. So we could address this by way of policies that also value this care work. So if a woman takes time from work to take care of a family member or for childbirth, they should not be penalized for that, right? They should still be able to maintain their rank within the workforce. I don't know if that addressed your question.
No, quite a bit. I mean, thank you for answering that question, Bekeh. And in continuation to the question, answering the question, I would like to tell Mr. Nirmal Singh that SDG 5, if you look at it, it does have indicators, as Professor Bekeh said, that there are policy. So there are indicators that there are policies which have inclusive policy, which focuses on women. So SDG 5, if you look at all the indicators and the targets within that, you will obviously find the answers. But the question again, and I think Professor Bekeh will agree with me, is how to implement them. Do we have actionable points? Do we have, I mean, it is with respect to each of the country, whether our voluntary national reviews address these issues, whether we have our national indicator frameworks which converge with that of the targets and indicators of SDG 5, that is what we have to see. So thank you for answering that question, Professor Bekeh. And I guess I encourage anybody else who have any questions or anything. So I would like to bring out a few points that I actually noted down with the ICOMOS policy guidance on culture, and within that the SDG 5. And so I'm just going to wrap it up slowly now. And so basically we have to see, as Professor Bekeh said, that we have to see women inclusive planning, urban planning policies, where we can look at the safety, and also women as cultural custodians. So basically we have to look at metropolis planning and heritage management, and from a gender lens. So, and when we do that, we go beyond the non-stereotypical and biases of women in heritage making and in the process of heritage making. And of course, we talk about equal access to enjoy heritage of all genders, including women, and involvement of all genders equally in identifying, interpreting, conserving, managing, and transmitting of the heritage, as Professor Bekeh has already said, and then discard gender-rooted cultural traditions. So so I'm going to wrap up the session, and so anything, any last comment, last line, anything for the road that Bekeh you would like to add?
No, again, thank you very much, Jenna, for summing up things very well. The last thing I just want you I want to leave you with this: always listen to women. Right? They have a lot to contribute. Yeah.
Thank you. That's amazing. Always listen to women, and they have a lot to contribute. Yes, definitely. And at this point, at this note, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Bekeh Ukelina immensely for giving us this opportunity to listen to his words, his thoughts, his ideas, works on this very relevant issue of gender equality. I would like to thank our knowledge partners, Cities Forum London, Center for Science and Environment New Delhi, Institute of Spatial Planning and Environmental Research at Panchkula, Haryana. For this particular lecture, I would also like to thank UN Habitat, UN Metro Hub, Universities Consortium, Heritage and Metropolis, Heritopolis. I would like to extend my gratitude to our chief patron, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Jaspal Singh Sandhu, for without whose approval and support, this distinguished lecture wouldn't have been possible. I would like to also thank our facilitator and Dean Academic Affairs, and also our nodal officer for RUSA 2, Professor Sarabjot Singh Behel. I'm most grateful to our chair, none other than Professor Dr. Ashwini Luthra, our backbone, and for his support always. Last but not the least, most essentially, Arvind, our backstage, our technical support, without whom our online webinars and lectures would not be possible, but unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. And I would like to thank, in his place, Khushi and Rupali for taking the reins firmly in his absence. And I would also like to thank our newcomer, Ankit. With a bit of teething problem, he has set himself on sail smoothly. And mostly, I would like to thank the entire team of IQAC and CSH to make this happen. I would like to thank my friend and colleague, Hunjai Kim, my fellow PhD scholar at the University of Cambridge, Department of Archaeology, to help me with the international coverage of this lecture series from the day of its inception on the Heritopolis UN Universities Consortium platforms. And once again, I extend my warmest of regards to Professor Bekeh Ukelina, and thank you on behalf of CSH and GNU. And I thank you all who logged in today and stayed till the end for being part of this lecture series. And we encourage you to log in next month for yet another issue pertaining to heritage, metropolis, and sustainable development goals. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor Bekeh, and it's been wonderful. Thank you, and listen to women.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you all, and hope to see you again next month.